Hello YouTube, welcome back to the channel. So we're doing one of these around the hobby episodes. I'm a little out of practice. It's been a while since I've done one of these. I used to do these semi-regularly when I thought there was a couple of different stories that I wanted to expand upon or something I wanted to make sure that I at least got a chance to go through before maybe the live stream or one of those situations. This is one of those ones because a couple of these ones I thought were interesting, so I'll talk on them a little bit. I'll include a link in the description to anything where applicable. So, for example, you're looking at the COMC blog right now talking about it. That's going to be the first one that I'm going to start with. But if there's anything else related to it, I'll include links to those in the description as well so that you can check them out on your own. I'm not going to commit to doing these again on a regular basis. It's going to be more than anything else. If a couple of things come up that I think are worthwhile to do in this format, then I have no problem bringing it back anytime where I think it's applicable. But a lot of times the live stream catches a lot of this stuff. And we can still expand upon it and talk about it some more on the live stream if we feel like we need to. But obviously, one of the big announcements this week was that COMC announced that, and eBay announced as well, that they were expanding kind of their partnership. They have already been in a little bit of connection for a long time because obviously COMC is a big consigner on eBay, and there is integration between the two companies because if you buy something on COMC that is also available on eBay, the two talk to each other and then one kind of goes offline versus the other. So there is already some integration, but this is an expansion upon it. And I wanted to focus on the COMC blog because they do talk about it from their perspective of it. But as part of this announcement, there's also investment in the COMC platform, which I actually think is really good. Now, before I get into it further, one of the things that I always like to mention is that if any of you have been following this channel for any length of time, you'll remember back, especially in the pandemic time period, I was extremely critical of a lot of things in COMC. Very critical because truthfully, they were doing a lot of things that I wasn't a big fan of. Some of it was not their own fault, but a lot of it really came down to their communication or lack thereof that they had. So I was highly critical of a lot of the ways that they were going about doing business. They had legitimate issues that the whole pandemic period caused for them, but they communicated it very poorly, and I thought that was a part of the issue at hand, and their service got progressively worse. But to their credit, and that's where I want to make sure that we always kind of touch on both sides of it, as critical as I was, it was also a situation where we were able to give them credit, where they started to turn the corner and things actually started to improve, and they did. And I think today COMC is a very usable platform. Is it perfect? Hardly. But I think they have added elements to it that I think are quite good, that I've talked about in the past. I'm a fan of the fact that you can now submit to two different graders through them directly, which is great. That's something they had done in the past, but they brought it back. And I like the CGC integration, and I like the fact that PSA is also part of the integration now, so you can submit directly through there as part of your COMC inventory, which is really good. And the fact is the various little features that they've had for a long time, like the ability to use it as a mailbox. The fact that it is kind of the OG vault, which I'll play into the eBay side of things here in a minute. I think all those things are good. The fact they've added an app, I think that's great. It's still pretty primitive, but the fact is we're seeing some growth and we're seeing some improvement, and hopefully this investment from eBay allows it to be better. I'll touch on a couple of points related to what they worked into the blog post here. So one of the first things that is included here is our new partnership with eBay is intended to expand access to our extensive portfolio of cards and collectibles to help scale our fulfillment services. So I want to focus on that here for a second. Scale our fulfillment services. That's one area where I've seen improvement, but it's one of those things where it can still definitely improve a lot more. Obviously, one of the things that happened as a result of the whole pandemic period was that it became difficult. They had the limited space, so they had to expand, and it became kind of that thing, that meme where they had that building you can see from space that I've had a lot of fun with during the live stream, and then the machine that helped them. But we are seeing some of that bear fruit. The new facility and the equipment and things that they were able to upgrade was eventually able to help them. They were able to finally improve to a point that I think it's tolerable. They have improved some of the infrastructure and some of the user experience, but again, it's still not perfect. But anything that helps improve and scale their fulfillment services, I'm a big time in favor of that. I think that's great. Now, keying in a little further down, you can see here, in particular, the investment. So this is eBay's investment in them. The investment will enable COMC to expand our technology-based listing and management model, strengthening our fulfillment services, so again, emphasis on that, and allowing fellow collectors to focus on what they enjoy. A lot of it is marketing fluff, but the fact is, anything that helps them improve and speed up elements of it to make it a lot more efficient, I think is going to be a really good thing for that aspect of it. And kind of lastly here, it's that this means we'll have greater resources to invest in further innovating our technology. So I really think that's going to come down to, again, they already talked about fulfillment a couple of different times. I'll look forward to seeing some more particulars, but this is, like I said, one of the points that I had during that entire time period where I was being a lot more critical of them was the communication thing is always a little lacking. I do appreciate the blog, though, covering some aspects of this, and I'd like to see that expanded because I'd like to see more about what specifically fulfillment-wise. Because one of the things I'd like to see in the long run is an enhancement on a lot of the standardized shipping, because it's one of those things where you do pay a lot. So I'll speak from the Canadian experience, but obviously in the US it's a little different experience. It takes a long time to fulfill. Unless you go with one of the elevated options, it's very expensive, and you still have to wait a relatively long time. Now, part of that is just because the way the nature of the COMC warehouse and the way they do their thing is that you're individually picking all these SKUs. That's part of the reason why no one else has really attempted the kind of setup. You've had competitors for different platforms, but COMC is kind of unique in the sense that each one of the cards in there is an individualized SKU, which is not something that I don't think anybody else wants to take on. Even something like a Star Stock or something like that, you're using stock photos. When you're looking at a photo, you're not getting the exact card. So when you go into COMC and you look at a card, that card, if you order that one and that's the one you add to your inventory and that's the one you have shipped to you, that card in that picture is the one that you're getting, not a stock photo. And then there's maybe 20 copies that they have, and then they grab one off the pile and give it to you. In this case, you're getting the exact one you're looking at, which has always been a very labor intensive model. And then having that sheer number of SKUs and trying to keep track of it and making sure you get your stuff. I understand why it takes longer to pick it, but it's one of those things where in some cases it takes weeks. It just really depends. It's one of those things where anything that can improve that, I'd be hugely in favor of, and I'm hoping that some of this investment does that. And if it also improves the integration between the two, because as I said, they already have integration. They've got the consignment services. They've gotten into the live auctioning side of things. So they're trying to expand the offerings that way. And I think that's a good thing, but it's one of those things where don't try to get into too many areas simultaneously. But we have definitely seen that they have expanded. They've slowly expanded that portfolio, and we'll see if that kind of plays into it. But as I said, I'll leave the blog post so that you can take a closer look at it. A lot of it is really high level stuff right now. That's why I just wanted to talk on a couple of these points, because we don't fully know what that's really going to entail and the depth and length of how far that investment goes into it. But the fact that eBay has seen fit to do that makes a lot of sense from eBay's perspective, because they are doing a lot of business together with the sheer amount of items that are consigned from COMC. And it just makes the integration easier for somebody who's already on the COMC platform and wants to take advantage of it. So anything that makes it easier and more seamless to do it from point A to point B, I think is a good thing for the collectors or the users that are using both platforms. So link to that one in the description, and let's move on here to the next one. Next one here that I wanted to touch on is actually SGC grading. And it's been one of those things that I kind of have fun. Again, in the same vein, I have a lot of fun with SGC. A friend of the channel, Baubles and Ball Cards, is an SGC bulk submitter. In the same way that Brad from PSA Canada was also a bulk submitter until PSA Canada became part of Collectors officially. So I kind of have fun with a couple of different friends and associations that are on both sides of that fence. But as far as SGC is concerned, one of the things that I've kind of enjoyed over time is watching the characterization and kind of the perception of, Peter Steinberg, SGC Pete, and how people look at him comparatively to some of the other CEOs for some of the other grading companies. I would say if you were going to take like a hobby poll, like a straw poll, I think he's probably one of the most popular executives from the grading companies. That isn't saying a lot though, because obviously a lot of the grading companies get a lot of flack, and a lot of times deservedly so for a lot of things. But I would say he's one that most people, I think, like him. It's one of those things where like people listen to him talk. He's a young guy. He's very enthusiastic. He's got a lot of energy. And I think a lot of people like that about him. So I think it's interesting. But part of that also is that SGC oftentimes spends a lot of time promising things and alluding to things in the future. That's why I always have a lot of fun on the live stream where I talk about it's like, oh, SGC, promised us flying cars and all these things, because it seems like they're always making promises about this thing that's coming down the road. And a lot of times it would almost be better to just focus on what the things that is that you do well and keep working on those and expanding on them. And they do to a certain degree, but it's one of those things they also keep alluding to this, oh, wait until this other stuff we got down the pipeline. Well, one of the things that was mentioned by them, in addition to the app, which they have recently delivered on, so good on them for that. One of the other things they mentioned, I want to say a couple of years ago now, was they talked about the idea of doing a podcast. And this is the first episode, the trial run, so to speak, for an SGC podcast. So you can kind of see that this is a work in progress. I think they're trying to figure out how they're going to fit it. It's inside of the SGC office, inside of the space. I actually don't mind the setup too much, but obviously I think it's going to require some refinement, and it's one of those things. I'm just glad to have it in the space. Even though it's obviously with a company, you always have a little bit of a line that you have to kind of balance. And I can speak to this a little bit because, as I mentioned, I did that work with PSA Canada, if several of you remember back with Brad, where we were working on stuff on the PSA Canada YouTube channel. And part of what made us go dormant is that when PSA Canada was a bulk submitter that worked with PSA, you had a little bit of a separation. You had two different companies. So when that situation is the case, we were able to do that directly because I was dealing with Brad directly as the owner of that company. And we were able to work on a program that allowed us the flexibility to be able to not only talk about industry things, hobby things in general, It allowed him to be able to answer questions based on the bulk submission business, but he was also able to talk about it from the perspective of a cart shop owner, someone who operates a cart shop. And he was also able to speak on it from various different perspectives, but it also meant that we could talk about other third-party graders. And that's one of the important key distinctions that I made emphasis on early on, when people, obviously calling it PSA Canada made it very confusing. But when PSA Canada officially went under collectors, we stopped doing the podcast. And part of the reason we stopped doing that live show and the podcast is because, well, at that point, it's under collectors. Collectors is the one who gets to dictate what they're going to talk about. And I'll get to PSA here in a second. But it changes the dynamic completely. You can know, well, you could, but it would probably be a bad idea to talk about other third-party graders openly, whether you like what they're doing or not, don't like what they're doing, because it doesn't make sense at that point. It's under the corporate ownership at that point. You have to be a lot more careful with what you say. So it always changes the dynamic to it. That doesn't mean, though, and I'll bring it back around to the SGC thing here, it doesn't mean that you can't talk about pertinent topics. It just means that you have to kind of think about it from the perspective of, as a company and a player in the space, how do you approach the topic in a way that's fair? Because if you just spend the time, talking down your competition, that's never going to look good. Or even if you try to prop them up, it's always going to be a little bit of a weird thing that you have to balance out. But speaking of general hobby topics, that's something that I always thought would be a good idea to do. PSA had their own podcast earlier, and what I found, if you guys been following that at all, is that the PSA pod changed. Because in the early days, and it wasn't that long ago they started it, but we've already seen a very drastic change in kind of the approach that they took to it. At the very beginning, it was a way for PSA to be able to communicate directly what was going on with them. And they had a new ownership. They could talk about that. They could talk about who was in charge of this, that, or the other thing. It also meant that they could give you and communicate directly to you different things like where the status of the backlog was. Because if you remember when the PSA podcast started, they were working on chipping away at that gigantic backlog, and they were able to give updates on where that was going and what things were being done as far as that's concerned. And my whole thing, when one of these companies decides to take on this content side of things, is that you always want to figure out a way of adding some element that you, being the third-party grader in this case, is able to give some kind of insight, some kind of information, something that the grader knows that I can't just get into 50 other places. At the same time, I love the fact that they were able to incorporate little aspects of the hobby early on. But then what happened is eventually it started to shift, and slowly we were getting less updates on the PSA side of things. You still get the odd one here and there, like if there's a grading special or something like that. But for the most part, if you pay attention to the current iteration of it, I think now they just call it the index, and they talk about, the various card ladder indexes and stuff like that, which is very niche. And then on top of it, they'll do these little, I guess, quote unquote, collector oriented segments where you'll talk about, oh, we'll do this, draft of these different inserts or these different cards or whatever, which is all fine and dandy, but it's not really fundamentally different than anything I couldn't get out of another hobby podcast somewhere else that's not affiliated directly with a third-party grader. It's one of those things where you're not giving me anything special that you have access to or information on. I'm basically just getting a watered-down version of another hobby podcast. It becomes just another hobby podcast lost in the sea of them. And I also do understand that there is a delicate balance. That's why I gave you that example with the PSA Canada one. When I was able to do that with Brad and we were able to communicate directly what we wanted it to be, we wanted to make sure we incorporated aspects of the hobby. So I think but as soon as you go fully corporate and it's actually owned by the parent company and, you have to kind of work your way around that, you can't really talk about the other third-party graders anymore, which I get, but that doesn't mean you can't talk about general hobby topics. And in this first episode, and I'll leave a link to this one in the description for you if you want to check it out, I don't mind the concept that they're working on it. They do spend a lot of time kind of patting themselves on the back, but that's to be expected when you get one of these type of podcasts. We will see, because they did talk about the Babe Ruth 1914 Baltimore news card. Stuff like that I'm completely okay with. I like that, because then you can still incorporate talking about certain newsworthy cards or certain specific topics in the hobby or general topics, and then interweave a little bit about, this is what we're working on in SGC, we're doing this, or, we had a great month because of this, and maybe give a couple of reasons for it. That's where you, as SGC in this case, or PSA in the other case, can give some kind of insight to people that are not on the inside. This is something that you're bringing to the table that somebody on the outside doesn't know. That is always, I think, key to differentiating yourself, because otherwise you just become another hobby podcast. So this is a trial run for them. I guess they'll be a work in progress. I'm sure they'll refine it and work on some aspect of it based on feedback. So I'll leave it to you if you want to check it out. I think it was a decent first episode, kind of a trial run for them. We'll have to see how consistent they are with it, how well they're able to adjust or adapt based on whatever feedback they get. But I'm glad to have that voice in the space. But I'm hoping that they don't go down the path of the PSA pod where it becomes kind of this very niche thing where it's like, if you're really into, I guess, staring at indexes and things like that, then I guess there's something there for you. But I just found that over time, I'll still listen to it just to see if anything changes. But I found that it lost a lot of traction very early on when you got away from including something that only you could provide. From what I recall, also, I have to double check. I haven't looked into it as closely, but I think CSG got Ali, formerly from Titan Cards, to do kind of a show for them. So I think that's smart because you're incorporating some entertainment elements into it as well, and including the cards and including some of these other pieces. That's kind of the direction that I would point to a lot of these companies. I think there is value to having some kind of a podcast or, expanding a YouTube channel and including things like that. The collector oriented content I think is really good, but you also want to be able to provide something unique in the space that you have access to that other people can't just do. Because otherwise I can just look at some other hobby podcast to get just general discussion on this or that, because they're not necessarily bound to focus in on, their themselves as a company. If you're going to focus on yourself as a company because you have to, and you can't talk about the other companies in the space, then at least bring me something to the table that I can't just get in 10 other places. So those are just some high level thoughts from me, kind of just thinking through the whole thing. Again, kudos to them on at least getting an episode. The first step is actually starting and actually getting something out there. So good on them. And then hopefully they refine it. And if they get some good feedback, maybe it'll improve, and I'd like to see them give it a shot. Good luck to them. And more than anything, hopefully they learn the lessons from other examples in the space. Like I like what CGC is trying to do. At least they're trying something a little bit different. PSA started off with something that I thought was interesting and then kind of watered it down. Honestly, for me, here's something I'll quickly throw in here at the end before I get to the last thing. If it was me and I was over at PSA, the first thing I would say to them is, okay, look, if you want to have this, incorporate it as part of a show. Don't make it the whole show. I still like to have a little bit of hobby news or industry stuff related to it. If you can talk about it, if it's something that is open-ended enough for you to be able to discuss, and or they've got a magazine, and in the magazine you have articles talking about various things. Maybe it would make sense to incorporate some aspect of that into a podcast or show where you can talk about some of the articles and maybe expand upon it in some way. Maybe there's some more information that wasn't included in the article that you could add, that so then it could become a complement to other content that you're creating. It's always tricky to find the balance in the content space, but it's one of those things that I kind of think about all the time. It's like, well, what would I do if I was given the option to be able to throw in my 2 cents and be like, what would you change? What would you modify? And that's one of the things that I think about. If you've got something you're doing well or something that could potentially be really good, maybe include that element of it. And then by being able to do video or audio, you can complement. It can be an expansion on what's already in the magazine, for example. That's one of those things where that to me is like an easy win if you decided to go down that path. So we'll see if SGC decides to take advantage of that, because here you've got a visual medium. You've got audio, but you've also got video. You can be showing things on the screen. You can then give some insight. You could talk about some of the grading process. That's why I said a moment ago, by doing this, you have the option, if you choose to do so, to pull behind the curtain and give people a little bit of that insight that they will not get by watching one of the other pieces of content. They don't have that access. Well, you're already in the office. You could give a little bit of that access. You could have a grader come on and talk about some of the things they think about or some of the processes. You don't have to give away the secret sauce, so to speak, but you can still give a little bit of insight, a little bit of information. All the grading companies have the exact same opportunity if they choose to do so in this kind of a format. That's kind of what I think about that. Lastly, Robert Edwards Auctions. I did mention that 1914 Baltimore News Babe Ruth. I didn't get a chance to talk about it on the live stream. We'll probably talk about it a little bit briefly. There's not too much to say. I think it's a cool card. It's one of those things where you're a big baseball card collector, a big baseball fan. Babe Ruth is obviously one of the biggest names in the sport, and this is obviously going to be a gigantic card. So as it sits right now, as I'm recording this, there's a little over 3 days left, and right now it sits at a bid of $5.75 million. So I think what's going to be kind of an interesting question, and something I would post to you in the comments section, and I'd be curious to get your thoughts on it. Where do you think it winds up? It is a massive card, but it's one of those things where you kind of have to know what you're looking at a little bit. Obviously, it's people with money, so hopefully they know what they're looking at. But it is definitely going to be a big ticket item when it finishes selling here, because it is an interesting card with a unique provenance. Very different, because obviously it predates year-wise his time with the Yankees. It's early in his career. He's technically under the International League with Baltimore at the time that this card is happening. And it is a unique card because it comes from a newspaper, and you can go look into the provenance on that a little bit. It's a very different and unique card. Now, it also made sense for SGC to talk about it when they did their podcast episode, because it is in an SGC slab. So it's not a coincidence that probably that was an excuse. I'd be curious, by the way, from the discussion I had a little earlier in the previous thing, I'd be curious if SGC would talk about would they still talk about this card if it was in a PSA slab? I'd be kind of curious about that. I don't know. I just think that's why I say, if you're like a third-party grader, it makes it kind of tricky. You're kind of limited if you decide that you can't mention or talk about any of the other third-party graders, it kind of puts you in a little bit of a box. That was one of the things I liked when I was doing the PSA Canada show, is that, yeah, we could literally talk about any of the third-party graders because they were a bulk submitter that worked with PSA, but we weren't bound by some contract to never speak of the other graders. We could talk about them whenever we felt we needed to, and discuss positives or negatives. Is one of those things where we had that option. And then obviously it changes. You want to kind of focus mostly in your own lane, but I like when you can talk about hobby topics. And if you want to do the collector-centric topics, I think that's great too. I think that can complement, but then bring some of your own insight, because that's where I think the value is in a podcast or video versus what anybody else can do. So just curious if any of you have any thoughts on how this card's going to do. We've got 3 days left, so we'll have to see how far this one goes as far as the bids. Does it crack 8 figures? Do we get to 10 million plus? Curious if you have any predictions. And of course, as mentioned, I will include a link to this one in the description if you want to check it out for yourself. So that's it for me for now. More videos coming up on the channel. As I said, I'll do a couple of these here and there. If I get a couple of different things inside of one video that I think would be worthwhile, that I don't want to do standalone videos on, that I think would be fun and fit in this format. But otherwise, I'd like to get any thoughts and comments. Feel free to throw those in there. Otherwise, more videos coming up on the channel. Live streams on Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll be back this Friday here to talk about some more things. We'll probably touch on a couple of these topics and some other things and open it up to the chat and see what the rest of you want to talk about. With that said, if you like the video, subscribe to the channel. Thanks very much, and we'll catch you in the next one.